Welcome back, Cross Connectors. Here we are, ready to take on the question once again of, how do we talk about God?
Who is God?
I don't know if anyone's coming back after last week's discussion.
I know our Cross Connectors are dedicated listeners, and they want to know more about this.
They heard the first two, and they're going to come back for the next two, right?
Two more.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we promised them that we would actually get into Scripture this week.
Yeah.
Tie
Okay,
back
we'll
to
definitely
last
do
season.
that.
And
Should we do a quick
help them
recap for those?
yeah.
So we're talking about the four sort of classic philosophical ways of understanding God.
Yep.
And these
Out
are
of a-
based
yeah.
on Peter Rollins and a conversation that Peter Rollins had
A theologian
with Rob,
who you know.
philosopher and theologian who I have run into and stayed in my house. And he had a conversation with Rob Bell, another theologian and Christian pastor. And so his four ways of understanding, like when we say God, what do we mean by God? And the first way was God is super being, and that is God who is bigger than us, but very similar to us. Likes the same people we like, dislikes the same people we like. Is sort of an extension of our ego and sort of functions in our life like a character.
Like a superhero. Like a
superhero.
Captain America.
Yeah, whenever I haven't seen this bumper sticker in a while, but the bumper sticker that says, God is my co-pilot, like that's super being.
Yeah.
Right. And then the next one is God is hyper being, which sort of sounds like the same thing, but is God that is wholly WHO. LLY. Thank
Also,
you. I had to think about
HOLY.
it. It was like, how many L's? It's like trying to do math in front of people. Wholly different than us, is our finite, is infinite. God is infinite, and our finite brains cannot figure out who or what God is. And any God that we do understand, I finally figured out God, that is not God, because God as hyper being it's like God is an ocean, and we're coming at God with a thimble, and we're getting a little bit out. We get a little touch, we get a little taste, but we do not get the whole thing, because that would be impossible. And we said that is the orthodox, the standard understanding of God. And pretty much any mainstream Christian tradition, God, the theologians would say that God is along the lines of the hyper being.
Right. That this way of talking about God uses images and metaphors. Our scriptures are replete with images and metaphors for God, but that no one single image or metaphor truly captures what and who God is. Whereas that super being one would not really be the classical orthodox way of understanding God, because it just takes some of those images and metaphors too literally, which becomes a problem.
Right. We also talked about how this is important in Christian development, faith development, that typically when children come to the church, in Sunday school, in vacation Bible school, we aren't talking about God as infinite mystery who is too large to understand, because that would blow kids' minds away. That's not, they do not, small children do not think in categories that are that abstract. And so we talk about God as a super being who comes and who loves us and who wants us to love him, and God in very concrete ways. And then we develop out of that. We need a God who is larger.
Here's maybe a good example of just what you're naming, and the way this lines up with you talking about hyper being as the orthodox way of talking about God. When you tell a child God is your father, right?
Yeah.
You do not sit them down usually and then also go, hey, just so you know, I told you God is a father, but God isn't literally a father.
Right.
God isn't a man that has reproductive parts that's sitting up in a cloud above the sky. Right? Like, you don't explain these things about how the image actually breaks down. You don't go, and John actually says God is spirit. And we know that spirit is beyond, male and female being as it exists on earth, right? Like, you don't sit down and explain those things. But if you read any Orthodox theology from Christian history, when it talks about God as Father, it's going to explain this, right?
Yes,
that this is a metaphor, this is an image, that it breaks down for X, Y, and Z philosophical reason. Yep. So, that would really be the distinction.
Kids think in literal terms, but as we age, we are able to think in more abstract terms. This is a funny story we heard yesterday. My wife, Karen, we were sitting talking to our daughter, and Karen remembered a story from her early childhood where something came up, probably on television, and we had to like address the birds and the bees like way earlier than we really wanted to. And so I gave a very like, oh, well, like you have eggs in your belly. And then one time someday when you get married, then you'll take those eggs could become people, become children.
Mm-hmm.
Why did I say that? Like that. So like an hour later, I started like wrestling with her and tickling her. And what she said was, Daddy, be careful of my eggs.
Wow.
Because what she was picturing when I said egg was
Chicken
like,
eggs.
was a chicken egg,
Yep.
Yeah.
right? And like not a microscopic thing that you need a like special equipment to see.
Yeah.
Like she thought very literally. And so
Right.
when we talk about God with little children, we talk very literally and concretely. But
Yeah.
hopefully as kids get older into, Elliot's youth group, we start using larger.
Yeah. That's where I
Last-
give them a more in-depth birds and the bees, right?
Hey,
Let the listener be aware that is a joke.
Yeah, right.
I
All right.
mean, hey, growing up in my youth group growing up, there was.
Oh, yes. Some
yeah.
unfortunate things happen in elder youth groups.
Oh, yes.
Well, I wasn't.
80s.
It
Yes.
wasn't terribly unfortunate. Well, I didn't grow up evangelical, so
yeah.
it was a different. It was
Depends what youth group you were in.
You weren't in mine, so
No, you were
actually
not
it
in
may
mine.
have been. Was it youth group or was it confirmation? All I know is there were bananas involved. Anyways, moving on.
Whoa, wow.
We
Okay. Two of
when
them.
we talk about that this shift that you should be doing as you're growing between super being, hyper being in theory, it reminds me when we were talking about Jonah last season.
Okay.
And how so often the story that people remember is the one from Sunday school, right?
Right.
The version of Jonah where it's Jonah
in
and
a
the
whale.
whale and all of that.
It's so cute.
And that it's missing so much more of what's actually
It's
there
a whole story about
in
mercy
Scripture. It's about
and the
mercy.
expansive mercy of God that is beyond ours, right?
Right. And you get less of like, you when you really read it, you hear more of Jonah complaining and you see more what God is trying to do with the community and how other people are believing in this God.
Right. And how the
it's
real
like-
story of Jonah isn't, could a man survive in the belly of a fish for 3 days, but how big is God's mercy and how much of that mercy can I live with,
Right.
right? And show.
Yeah.
That's the question of, like, and so that's the same thing here.
And sometimes the difference between our capacity for mercy, which is sometimes smaller than what God's capacity for mercy is.
Right.
So that's just kind of a way to tie back to last
great. I love
season
that.
about how our development as we kind of grow and in our faith, we make these shifts. We see more, the deeper. Maybe we have slightly more than a thimble of water that we get to understand.
Yeah.
We do have some listeners who really love Jonah. I still, up to a couple weeks ago, I was hearing about our episode on Jonah. So,
Oh, that's great.
It's good. All right. So those are the two ways we dealt with last time. So now we're going to go, and these two, I think we're going to be able to go a little quick, a little bit, although Elliot has some things to say and he's ready to go.
So yeah.
So the third way, according to Peter Rollins, is God as ground of being. This is a phrase that is drawn from a theologian in the 20th century whose name is Paul Tillich, who identifies God as ground of being. And we had a little bit of a discussion on this last week as to whether God is hyper being extended beyond God as a being. But when we get to God as ground of being,
This is off the deep end. This
we
is
have
full,
stepped
yep.
completely off the ledge of understanding God as a being, that God transcends the category of being. And that, so specifically in God as ground of being, God is that which all being emerges from. So we have an existence, there's a universe, there's planets, there's sun, moon, stars, fish, manatee, us sitting around this table. There are all these things that do exist. I exist, you exist, the chairs that we sit on exist. But God is the one that from which all this existence emanates and emerges from.
Right.
So now, is this the one where when you're trying to explain God to your kid and your kid says, so if God created the world, who created God?
Yeah.
Is this where you hit into that, like, well, God just is?
Yep.
Like, is this ground of being? Or is that still sort of,
So
or God isn't
No, I think
in this case.
that's a really great
Yeah.
example, because what that child is doing is asking the question and the problem that animates where this category for thinking about God
Yeah.
comes from. When you talk about a watch, right? A watch has certain properties. It's clearly been constructed. A watch does not create a watch, right? Like that's
Yeah.
just not what watches do. They do not create themselves. Something creates a watch. That's the very nature of a watch. And so what that child is recognizing when they ask that is like, where did all of this come from? And then by extension, where did God come from? And it doesn't make sense. Like this way
So
of
if there had to be a
thinking-
watchmaker, who made the watchmaker?
Exactly.
Right? Yes.
Right.
Right.
And you would have this infinite regression of who, unless you reached a point where there is something greater and more than being itself, right? Like
a first cause.
yeah, first
Right.
cause, the unmoved mover in Aristotle. So, what that child is implicitly recognizing is that all of beings, Rick said the manatees, the giraffes, us, this table, trees, cannot have come from another being, right? Like there has to be something bigger than this category. So bigger than the category of being must be the being, it's a ground of being, the condition upon which all being rests.
So this is beyond a hyper being because there's not really a being.
Hyperbeing is still a being
Right.
for the most part.
Right.
But here we're off. The other thing I think that ground of being does is to understand God as being is to make God smaller, right? Like if this table has being and this chair has being and, a manatee has being, to say that God is just another being in the universe, albeit a larger and more infinite being, to say it's that God has the same register of existence, exists just like the table, just like the manatee, is to turn God into a very small thing.
Yep.
This God as ground of being takes the category of God and just explodes it out and says that God is completely other and different from us in every way, which is what hyperbeing does. But now it says God is completely different and other than us in terms of being.
Yeah. Right.
So you talked last week that hyperbeing is kind of the orthodox understanding of God. What is this then? Like, is this beyond what's like, if you imagine this way, do you get to still call yourself an Episcopalian?
Sure,
Like-
sure. And so Elliot did a really good job last week of linking this understanding up, and probably he talked about hyperbeing as a large spectrum.
Yeah.
And
Oh yeah, I was starting to get lost around then.
As most people do.
No, I thought I was understanding stuff, and it may have just been that day and the lateness of the day. But yeah, okay.
The further you go along the spectrum towards this as ground of being, you end up into the realm of the mystics.
Yeah.
And there's this class, this group of Christians who stand in the Orthodox tradition. And many of these are considered saints of the church. But and we're talking like Meister Eckhart, Julian of Norwich, others that do understand God as beyond the category of being. What was it? Meister Eckhart will talk about.
I pray to God to rid me of God. He talks detachment becomes really big. Release becomes really big. There becomes this experience for the mystics in which all of our preconceived notions about God kind of fall away. Very much similar to the ending of Job, right?
Yeah.
I was going to talk about Job some today
That's
with
awesome.
these categories where Job wants God to be a super being. Job wants Job, it starts with this very mythical kind of folk tale story about a God that makes a deal with the devil and all of Job's things are taken away. But really what that folklore setup is meant to bring us to is this ending in Job where it's like you cannot even begin to fathom. Remember, there's the whirlwind and the
Job is making God smaller.
Yes.
And he's like, God has done me wrong.
Yep.
And if there was just a lawyer who could stand between me and God, a judge, that lawyer would determine that God is wrong because he has shrunk God down into a category of he's wronged me.
And remember, we talked about in our Job episode, if listeners go back and listen to it, it's somewhat unsatisfying because as readers, we want an answer from God to Job as well.
Right.
And what happens is what we said in that episode is an experience of God replaces an answer from God. And I think on this spectrum of superbeing and into hyperbeing, there is still a desire to say things about God that can give us kind of neat answers about who God is, what God is like. And I think as you get to the end of hyperbeing and you start moving into the mystics, you get to this very transcendent understanding of God where there's an experience of God that is very hard to put into human language. I think ground of being gets the closest to like Eastern spiritualities like Zen Buddhism and other ways of thinking, that it's very much rooted in not being able to conceptualize.
And so one of the, we are used to, especially in the scriptures, thinking about God in terms of light.
Mm-hmm.
In God, there is no darkness at all. But the mystics talk about God as a darkness.
Right. Like John of the Cross.
St. John of the Cross, Saint John of the Cross. This is not somebody who stands outside the tradition.
No.
He's venerated in the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And yet things are like, God is like this like black hole that you just cannot reach into.
Yep. Yeah. And to your question, Natalie, about like orthodoxy, to some degree, orthodoxy, there's a spectrum within it, ways of thinking about God. The mystics and people that move into the ground of being, they can often really be the gadfly of the Christian tradition, the ones that are kind of annoyingly like, your God's too small, your God's too small, your God's too small, your God's too small. Like
almost kind of keep reminding us that like remember to stop shrinking God.
Exactly.
So this week,
your concept.
So this Sunday, it snowed.
Yeah, I love this.
And St. David's, like, honestly, it's been cooking. We've been cooking here. Attendance is up, like engagement is up. Things are really good. And so I was really hoping for another really good Sunday. And then it snows on Sunday.
Yeah.
And then it was just a few weeks ago, it snowed on Sunday. And I know like school teachers are like, why can't it snow on a Tuesday? I'm going, why is it snowing on Sunday?
Mm-hmm.
Because this is like the day of the week that we are like gearing everything towards. And like, I don't want to see a fall off in energy and engagement. And so I get in and I know it's going to be a down Sunday. And it was. I'm walking in with a parishioner and I said, here's a theological question for you. Why does God have it snow on Sundays of all days of the week? Like make it snow on a Wednesday. And this parishioner said, you're making God into an object.
Mm-hmm.
God is not to be objectified. God is not an old man in the sky who is trying to just make it snow on Sundays.
Yep.
Your God's too small.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, yes. Okay, but why is
Yeah, but still.
So there I was shrinking God down.
Yeah.
And their parishioner was like, nope. too
Because
small.
what this view recognizes in distinction to especially the super being view of God is we often, this is how we started the whole first podcast, we often like to use God for our own reasons. We often like to make God look like us. And this is really the view of the four views that fully militates against that. It's like, it is impossible for you to make God look like you because God is categorically different than you are. You are a being and God is not.
It also turns God into, understands God as something that is not to be understood.
Mm-hmm.
Like you just sort of, you take that and it goes off the table. God is only to be experienced.
Yeah, right.
God is, the darkness is a tool by which we can experience God. We're not going to figure God out. And so you just stop that right now.
Yep.
And you enter into the mystery and you experience God at that level.
So I think one thing where this gets quite radical for anyone that is like tracking along and is like, this makes sense, I like this, is obviously the correlate of being is existing as we understand it.
So
right?
does
Like,
God exist?
Yeah. So, I mean, you can say Rick exists, Natalie exists, Elliot exists, this table exists, the tree exists, the world exists, the universe exists. But part of what this view would say is that it doesn't even make sense to use the language God exists. Like they wouldn't say, no, God doesn't exist.
Right.
They would say, asking the question, does God exist, is like asking, is a square circle? Or asking, does existence exist? Like they would just say, it's a logically contradictory, meaningless question. Like the very nature of God, the very definition of God doesn't have existence as a correlate. Like that's just not how this works. Which, again, you can see where mysticism comes in here. because
Yeah.
Natalie's looking at me
Am
with
I-
a look on her face
Well,
like,
no, I
what the
was-
heck are you talking
Yeah.
about?
Okay, so scripturally,
Wait.
is that like I am that I am?
Yeah.
Yes, perfect reference.
Boom. You hit it.
Perfect reference. Right there, you're referencing
God
Exodus.
is existence itself.
Yeah, you're referencing
I am that I
existence.
am.
Like Moses wants to put God in a box, and God is like, no, I am who I am, and nothing you say to try to define me will define me. I am simply what exists. Another scripture reference I gave was Romans 4. This is when Paul is talking about Abraham and God's calling of Abraham and the way that God calls faith into existence. And what Paul says in Romans 4:16, it's almost like he's giving a ground of being definition of God. He says, God is the one who gives life to the dead, referencing both Abraham and Jesus, referencing the way he's able to bring life out of Sarah's barrenness. So God is the one who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. And so part of what these theologians would say is like God is the condition of being. Like that only the condition of being can call into being that which is not.
So even the beginning of the Gospel of John, which famously uses the word logos, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This was a Greek concept, a Greek word, logos, and it was used by Greek philosophers as like being the underlying principle to the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And what John says in his prologue is that which the Greeks are calling the underlying principle that governs existence, that is Jesus.
Yep.
That is God.
So that does also go all the way back to Genesis 1.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Although,
Genesis 1 it's a little squidgely on this.
but
yeah.
Because it almost kind of makes it seem like there's a being there, and this is kind of God isn't actually a being, but it's also
The underlying-
it's also the pre-underlying.
that which allows existence to exist.
But
right.
you are also right in the sense of what we talk about with Genesis and with the Pentateuch as a whole is we talked about these different sources, right? This is traditionally known as JDEP.
Yes.
And these sources, these letters are an acronym that stand in for names of God used in these areas. And what modern scholars think is that these are different communities and traditions of the Jewish faith writing about God. And so long story short, this goes way back to the beginning of our last season, is right there in Genesis, we have these two creation
Yes.
accounts. And in the first one, it is a very cosmic, transcendental understanding of
God speaks.
where God's literal speaking brings everything into existence in some
Yes.
sense, right? In the other version, God's walking in the garden, God's forming the people out of the dust.
Adam and Eve hide, and God's like, where are they?
Yeah, God's literally
I
like,
can't-
where are
I
you?
can't find them. And then
so that's kind of like a super being version of God
Yes.
in Genesis
Genesis 2
2-ish.
is
Yeah.
absolutely a more super
And
God.
if you remember
Absolutely.
when we talked about Genesis 1, this is a part of the Jewish tradition that views God very reverently, that there cannot be images of God. God is not human-like. God is very other. And borderline God is the ground of being, right?
Yeah.
God is not just like a king on a throne. God is above everything that exists. Again, connected to the end of Job, some other places in the Old Testament. But again, you see there are these different images of God right there in the scriptures.
yeah.
So you brought up idolatry, and I think we want to come around to that, although maybe Rick's not ready to go there. He had something else to say.
No, we can go there.
Okay. So when I was listening to Peter Rollins describe this, he talked a lot about idolatry being a problem, and especially in this area, that there's sometimes the ways in which we're doing when we imagine God, and we imagine God in more of the super being and maybe some levels of the hyper being, that's in it of itself. Those who are more on the ground of being side of things would say that the super being, hyper being versions that we're imagining are idolatrous or verge upon idolatrous.
Yeah. So to define real quick idolatry for our listeners, because
Yes.
that's a word we
Oh,
use a lot.
so
You're like,
good.
wait, what the heck is actually
Let's
idolatry?
remind everybody.
this
I'm the
is-
one who brought it up. And I'm like,
this is
wait,
not
we
a
should-
modern concept. To me, and anyone can give a different definition, if I was going to give a very simple definition of idolatry, it would be making God look like us. And us is a very expansive category. Us can be a golden calf, right? Like us is things on this plane of our understanding, our existence. So to your point, Natalie, this position is really, like we talked about with the mystics, the most militant against trying to make God look like anything like us, right?
Yeah.
This position would say idolatry happens when we take symbolic, metaphorical statements for God and we take them too literally, right? I remember in one of our Cross Connections podcasts, Rick really helpfully used the example of God as a rock, right? Like this is what this
Right out of the Psalms.
Right out of
God
the
is my
Psalms.
rock and my salvation.
And, what idolatry does is, and we see this all throughout the Old Testament, is it takes a special rock it found and it puts it in its living room. And it says, this rock is, in some sense, God's presence in my home. And I am going to do things to get this rock to help me because God's my rock. God's my safe harbor. I have enemies in my life. I am going to build things around this rock. And even if it doesn't understand it in completely literal terms, like that God is not fully encapsulated by this rock, it takes things of our existence and it makes them stand in for God such that we begin to worship it. We begin to do things for it. And again, this is a view of God that's very premised on like using God for my own ends, right? Even seemingly good ends of like, who doesn't want protection from their enemies, right? But to Rick's point with the question of the parishioner on Sunday, we turn God into an object that can be used, right? So like the classic one all through the Old Testament is these images of God like Baal, the storm god. Of course, if you live in that culture, you're going to be like, I'm going to try and do things to get God to get it to rain.
All I want is rain.
Rick's going to try and do things to get God to not let it snow on Sunday so we can have our continued engagement and attendance.
Just a couple weeks ago, the Eagles were playing the 49ers, and I made right? So we posted on social media about it, and I reminded us all, God has no favorites.
Right.
Our clergy and our staff do.
Is that true, though?
I mean, I saw a video of the Catholic priest blessing the end zone of the Steelers. And then did you see that with holy water?
No.
Really?
You didn't see that?
No.
It was the game where they beat the Ravens, too. Like, biggest game of the year in some sense. Maybe even bigger than the playoffs.
The Pope is a Bears fan, and the Bears just lost. So
if that doesn't disprove
if that
this,
doesn't
right?
tell you.
Well, and you'd think that the Saints would always win.
But we joke, like, this is really funny, and everyone listening is like, obviously God doesn't have a sports team. But what this view would say is there are so many areas in our life that even unconsciously, we begin to treat God this way.
Yeah.
We get a flat tire, or let's make it a little more serious, a loved one dies. And we think that God did this. We think that God's angry with us. We think, what could I have done to appease God? If I had prayed harder, would God have intervened?
Or how can God let this happen is the other way in which we're kind of making an idol of God when something horrible and tragic happens.
Yep.
So we've talked about God as ground of being, and we showed some scriptural support of that. We've now gone back and talked about super being, and that there's some scriptural support of that. I mean, basic. While we're also going back, there's also some scriptural places where we see God as hyper being. I think about the two moments where God is speaking to Moses and then later speaking to Elijah. And then God says, I'm going to pass by. And so God there is presented like a character that's going to come pass by, right? But then the means by which God passes by, for Elijah, for example, is in the still silence. Like there's an earthquake, but God's not the earthquake. And there's a fire, but God's not the fire. And then the Hebrew gets a little weird there, but it's like the sound of sheer silence is like a good interpretation of that. And that's where God was.
Yeah.
Like, so God is coming like a character and God's going to walk by, but God is other than. It's not a humanoid figure that's walking by. In Moses, when God walks by, Moses can't see God, but Moses can see the place where God just was.
Yeah, right.
And so again, like he's coming like a character, but it's like he's not just a character.
Or remember the covenant with Abraham? It's a really bizarre passage where there's like split doves and calves, and God passes through like
the midst.
fire.
Yeah.
So that would be another example of that. And that connects right there, like Moses and Elijah. There's really this emphasis on not being able to see God because God's being is so beyond, right? Remember, that's what hyper means, just beyond. And that connects right with John 1:18, where the author of the Gospel of John says, no one has ever seen God.
No one has ever seen God.
What an interesting thing to say when you really think about that, because there is seemingly a lot of places in the Old Testament where people have seen God. But the author of John, with this understanding of God as logos, is really using this heightened understanding.
Yeah, like you've seen manifestations of God, but you have not. No one has ever seen God himself, and that's one of those places where it says like God is not in a category that we can see. God is not in the category that we can understand. God is larger than our eyes and our mind.
Yeah.
So when I was a kid, I was trying to understand my theology, and I was trying to come up with ways to understand this whole like not actually being able to see or look at God kind of thing. And I remember coming up with, and this falls apart at some points too. I remember that I conceived that God was like the sun. You can't look at it directly, right? But you can get some sense of God by looking at the moon, because the moon reflects the sun. So here I am trying to combine my science with my theology and like try to, it's like, but you don't get all of it because it's just a reflection of something greater that you can't actually look at head on and fully see and understand.
Yeah.
Man, young Natalie was literally giving an apologetic argument that was developed by C.S. Lewis without even realizing it.
Really?
Yeah,
C.S. Lewis?
wow.
I've read, the only C.S. Lewis I have read thus far is The Chronicles of Narnia.
There's a line that people love from C.S. Lewis, and I'm going to butcher it because I'm not looking at it. This is off the top of my head, but it's something like he says, God or Jesus is like the sun. We can't see it, but by it we see everything else. And his point apologetically is
Peter
like,
uses that. Peter Rollins uses that all the time.
yeah, it's like the point is that it's when we accept this, everything kind of comes together. Everything makes sense. But his whole point is he's actually kind of arguing against apologetic arguments that would try to prove the sun exists, right? He's like, no, this all comes together in its effects and the things that it does. So, but that's so funny. As a child, you basically came up with that argument to make sense of God. So,
Are you surprised, Elliot?
No, I'm
Are
not
you
surprised. Frankly, I'm
at
not.
all. No. Ahead of,
Who knew?
always ahead of her time.
So we've gone back some.
So we have God as super being, God as hyper being, God as ground of being. And so the last one, are we ready?
I'm ready.
Is God as event.
And this one I disliked the naming of the most because
I like it because it's so different, right?
Yeah.
Like it's
Well, it shows you right off the bat, right? You had super being, hyper being, grounded being. Being is in all three of these.
Right.
Here's this fourth one. What's going on?
event. So event it's a philosophical term. So it's not like event like you're throwing a party, having a barbecue in your backyard, or building a snowman, I guess what we'd be doing right now. But event in the philosophical sense is a thing that breaks into our normal life and created order and utterly changes everything by it. It's a breaking in. This Peter, when he talks about this one, goes to the young thinker. Her name is Simone Veil, and Veil is spelled Weil. And she lived in like the 40s, 30s, 40s, something like that.
1930s and 40s.
Died very young.
Was a mystic in some sense.
Was a mystic, and she wrote has a series of writings called Gravity and Grace. I have read Gravity and Grace. It is a trippy read. Like it is, you need to take some time with like each page. It is so thick, and each page doesn't quite follow from the next. It's like, what are you talking about? But the basic sense is that we live in a state of gravity where things are like mundane and hard, and life, we sort of plod on with life, and sometimes it's a better day and sometimes it's a worse day, but things just sort of plod on. But then every once in a while, there is a grace that just breaks into our life and sheds light and lightness, and we go, and it either changes our life or it changes our lives.
Yeah.
And what Peter says and what Simone Veil says is that God is not the being which sends grace, but God is the grace that breaks in and changes our lives. One of the classic ways of sort of understanding the philosophical event is by shrinking it down and understanding it as love. And, all of us in this room have all fallen in love, right? And I'm sure many of our listeners have fallen in love too. And when you fall in love with someone, your life is changed. And like all of a sudden you're doing activities you've never done before. You're eating foods that you never would have thought to eat before, but because your beloved is introducing you to them, and that inbreaking of love changes the trajectory of your life. That's event. And again, it's not God that allows the love or brings the love or sends the love, but that God is the love that we experience that transforms our lives.
Right. One of the interesting things about this way of understanding it is that it recognizes this goes beyond an objective kind of state of affairs. So just for example, to stick with the love metaphor, I have met Karen Morley. Karen Morley is a great person. Very nice. Really enjoy being around her. I have not fallen in love with Karen Morley. And so
I'm really glad to hear that, Elliot. I'm really
Rick's wiping his brow.
Jeez.
And what's interesting is that part of what this category recognizes in the way you're describing it, Rick, is that this is an ineffable kind of inbreaking. That there was something about when you met Karen Morley,
that moment, that person,
like,
that day.
there wasn't an objective list you wrote up about
Right,
Karen
no.
that was like, oh, now actually I'm falling in love with her. You know, we actually try to capture this with the language of falling.
Oh,
that,
yeah.
You know, that it was like all of a sudden this hit you in a transcendent way. Another example.
And if you had the exact same experiences that we had, you might not have fallen in love with her. Because
exactly.
it is not a given that everyone's going to fall in love with Karen
Exactly.
Morley, right? But because of that particular moment and that particular person, somehow something broke in and I fell in love with her.
Right.
And vice versa.
So it's really interesting you bring this up because just like I think a few days ago, somebody forwarded me this guy on Instagram, and the hook of his long Instagram post is falling in love is a lie.
Oh.
And he talks about that we're not thinking about falling in love the correct way. And I'm getting to why this makes sense because he talks about love being this source, and that when you fall in love with somebody, what's actually happening is that you are falling into this source, which is love, and coming close, which is love, which exists within you, is part of who you are, and you're coming closer to that itself. And the other person has the same thing going on with them, and that for some reason the two of you resonate in that, and that your being in this source of love together makes one another's awareness of that more vivid.
Yes.
Anyway,
Yeah,
so
that's
it
good.
just it kind of was like an
and that speaks
interesting
to the
way of describing,
transformative
and
part.
I think that
Right. Definitely. So that's a helpful way of framing this category, right? This idea of event as something that happens and God just being that call, right? So part of what we're saying, to be clear as well, is like when you fall in love with something, that's not God.
Right.
This is an analogy, a metaphor for the way that
Yes.
God's call breaks into our lives.
And when I typically talk about this, when I talk about the 4 ways, I usually spend a lot of time with the 3 ways. And then I just like glance at this 4th way and I go, this is a weird way of like super philosophical. There's like 5 people in the world who believe and who talk about God in this way. And then I go and talk about other things. But Elliot, you have some more things to say about this.
Yeah.
Because you think there's more than 5 people who think this.
Yes. So Peter's great. His explanation of this category is great. I think he approaches it in a little bit of a different way than I would. He is more focused on this philosophical category of event. In large part, that's influenced by this French philosopher Alain Badiou and his theory of the event. And that's all great.
God beyond being.
Right.
Or no, that's Jean-Luc Marion.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. And so where I would go with this category is actually a little bit different and a little more theological, a little less philosophical. I would define God as event as a theological movement that rejects the entire idea of talking about God with Greek philosophical concepts.
Yeah.
So in superbeing and hyperbeing, you're using the Greek philosophical concept of being and existence. Typically, these ideas related to being in existence that are found in Greek philosophy, like God needing to be unchangeable, God needing to be all-powerful, God needing to be the unmoved mover, right? Like you can find all of this in Plato and Aristotle's works, which then influenced most of Western philosophy and Christian theology. So you have that in the first two categories. And then in ground of being, you have a way that's trying to go beyond those two, but it's still wrapped up in talking about being, even in its rejection of the category of being, right? Like even as it rejects it, and we talked about that with idolatry, like it's still using it to go beyond it. When you get to God as event in modern theology, I think this is a way of doing theology that's fully just, we are not going to have that be our premises. And what it replaces that Greek way of thinking with is an attempt to go back to what I would say is a more fully Jewish way of thinking about God, in which in all of this Greek philosophy, God is completely separate from history. God and history are like oil and vinegar. They cannot go together because God needs to be infinite. When you get to God as event, I think it's trying to really think through, what does it mean to talk about God as a God that is present in history, a God that liberates the people of Israel from Egypt, a God that in the Deuteronomistic history judges the nations and promises a new heavens and a new earth, a God that is incarnate, right? Like how the heck do you talk about God as ground of being and then turn around and say, God dwelt among us in the person of Jesus Christ, who is fully human and fully divine, right? How do we talk about God raising Jesus from the dead as the definitive act of history, right? Yep. How do we talk about in Revelation the creation of a new heavens and a new earth where we will be resurrected, and a God who resurrects the dead, right? Like this just doesn't really fit with God as ground of being, or even God as super being or hyper being.
No.
So there's a lot more we could say there, but I think it's really trying to think through the importance of action and history, the importance of the acts of God within the history of the world and what that means for who God is, right?
Yeah.
Like, if we're going to talk about who God is, we're not going to talk about that abstractly through predetermined kind of philosophical categories. If we're going to talk about who God is, we're going to talk about what God does. And this is where this language of event comes in, this idea of God's actions come in. So there's more we could say there, but I think that's a good groundwork for thinking about this. Some of the key figures in this, we were talking about this pre-podcast, this really gets kicked off with Martin Luther and the Reformers. Yeah. So in the history of Christianity and the Catholic Church, really from like 300 AD up to 1500, Aristotle is the guy. Aristotle is, and philosophy, right, is central. And theology as
Greek philosophy specifically.
Yeah, sorry, Greek philosophy.
Yeah.
So then when theology is understood as the queen of the sciences, it's taking philosophy and taking Aristotle and it's synthesizing it with scripture and reflection on God. When you get to Martin Luther is like, Greek philosophy and Aristotle is literally from the devil. Because with Martin Luther and the Reformers, they want to push, how do we know things about God? Sola scriptura, we return to scripture. And so we look at the stories in the scriptures, and when we look at that, we see a God that walks in the garden. We see a God that when we pray is influenced by prayer and answers
our prayers.
Right. Mm-hmm. And these are things that Greek philosophy are like, God can't do that.
So what you were saying cannot be stressed enough. I know there's probably a few people on our podcast that are like rolling their eyes like, oh, this is like another rabbit hole they're going down.
Right.
Like in the history of our faith, Greek philosophy reigns large. And so much of what we would consider to be like just core teachings of Christianity actually don't come from the scriptures. They come from Greek philosophy, or they come from reading the scriptures through the lens of Greek philosophy, whether you know it or not.
Yes.
Like
it's the
not,
air we breathe.
It's not like you're sitting there in Bible study and like, okay, what does Plato say about this? It's just so. And the example I used is that we had like a 25-minute discussion before we jumped on the pod today about this. Is that what was my
about like souls
understanding
going to heaven
or like why why
Greek? So in Greek philosophy, physicality is bad.
Yeah.
The world is bad.
Right.
It is evil. It's where things rot and things break down and things don't last. But then there's the eternal. There's a totally different realm where everything is perfect. This is where you get Plato's theory of the forms, that like everything here is just a shadow of what's...
We talk about this in the Hebrews episode, the episode on the book of Hebrews from the New Testament.
Right. So what we do with that in just classic everyday Christian theology is we do with heaven, right? Like we say that, oh, our bodies die, they get buried here because our bodies are bad and they rot. But then our soul, which is perfect, that goes on to heaven.
Yep.
Right? Mm-hmm. And well, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Jewish conception of the world, there is no distinction between body and soul.
Yep.
And we see that ported over in the Christian New Testament as the body doesn't go away. The body is resurrected. We have a faith that believes in resurrection, where bodies get up, not just souls and bodies stay together. But even like just the basic way we conceive of and just talk about the afterlife is formed more by Greek philosophy than it is our own actual scriptural tradition.
That's why people don't cremate, because souls and bodies stay together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are some traditions that say we're not going to do that because bodies are important. Or the Orthodox Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity does not do that for that reason.
Yeah.
But we just talk about, oh, the body's here. Oh, it's okay because my soul's going off to heaven. And honestly, someone says that, I don't force the issue. I don't say, oh, actually, I know you're grieving right now, but you're actually technically wrong, and that's more Greek philosophy. I never do that. I just like, I know you're saying this, but I know that, here's what lies beyond that.
With that being said, the real 30,000-foot view here again goes back to the Greek view that infinite good, finite bad.
Yeah.
God is in the category of the infinite. The world and history in particular are under the category of the finite. And so these two don't mix. And so I think what this view really wants to wrestle with is God as self-giving, as presence, that God is bound up very intimately with history.
But not confined by it.
Depends. This view is a spectrum like others. So on one side of this view, it would say we know who God is through God's actions. And that truly is like the full revelation of who God is. But God, it would emphasize God's freely given grace, that God is not forced to do anything. Mm-hmm. Another side of this would say, once God makes the decision to create, God is bound up in, and in some sense even determined by, history. That we can't talk about God as being separate from history, as outside of history, once God has made this decision to create. I'm trying to think of a good analogy. It's almost like once the author has written the story, they are in it.
They are in the story.
They're not outside of the story anymore. So there's a whole movement of theology called process theology, or another term, but also a little bit different, would be open theology. And so an example here would be, this movement would say, God cannot, because of God's love. So again, remember, we're deprioritizing Greek conceptions of God. And they would say, when you deprioritize that, the fundamental category we get from our scriptures of God is that God is love, right? That's the 1 John quote. And so if God is love, God cannot coerce or force anyone to do anything, meaning God is not in control of history. And I think immediately, because Rick said Greek philosophy is the air we breathe, I think any listener is probably like, well, how could that be God? God's in control, isn't it? Isn't that the case? Like, isn't that what it means to be God? And what this movement would say is, well, that's what it means to be God if you're dealing with Greek philosophy. But they would say, look at the stories in the scriptures. Doesn't it seem like God's decisions are bound up with our decisions? Doesn't it seem like God doesn't necessarily know the future? Like, aren't there these stories in scripture in which someone prays, Moses prays not to destroy the people of Israel, right? And it says God changed God's mind. In the classical way of thinking about God, in some sense, this gets into really dense, difficult philosophical questions, but in some sense, God is fully aware of what will happen in the future and fully in control of what will happen in the future, which gets into really difficult questions of determinism.
Wait, I'm sorry, that's in that's in Greek.
I would say that's in Greek
that...
philosophy, and that's probably the way most Christians just tend to think about it.
Right.
Being influenced by Greek philosophy, right? They would say God's omniscient and God is omnipotent.
Right.
The problem
is... And it's that understanding from which people say, why did God let this happen?
Yeah, because if that's your view, I mean, it raises all sorts of thorny, tricky theological and philosophical questions. Because if God is omniscient and omnipotent, do humans have free will? Can they do anything? If the future is fully known, is anything actually our choices? If God is fully omnipotent, why that raises the problem of evil. So why is there evil? And so this movement of process theology and open theology says, well, you don't have any of these problems if you deny that God is omnipotent and you say that that's just a philosophical understanding of God, and if you say that God is not omniscient. So that's the two things this view does. It says you don't have the problem of evil because humans have free will and they impact God's decisions. And they also say God is not omnipotent because omnipotence is contradictory to love. Omnipotence forces and coerces things.
Yeah.
Love persuades. So they love the language of persuasion. They would say God persuades us with God's love and grace, but our decisions are outside of God's control. And if our decisions are outside of God's control, then in some real sense, the future is outside of God's control. Now, of course, they would emphasize this isn't a reason for fear that like God's love and persuasion will ultimately work, but they can't be, there's no certainty to that.
So I know that
I don't want to go too far. You feel free to rein this back in. Let me just say.
So I was just going to
Okay.
say, St. Paul does this whole thing that totally undercuts the omnipotent argument, where Paul talks about the weakness of God and uses that exact phrase, the weakness of God and the foolishness of God, that God is not in the category of power, and that if God has power, that power is manifest in weakness.
Yep.
Which is the very picture of the cross. Like the event which changes history and cosmic history is God dying on the cross, God absolutely being vulnerable.
Yeah, which
death,
is a
yeah.
foolish and absurd thing.
Which is a foolish and absurd thing.
And what is the most foolish and absurd thing of why Paul is saying this? That God dies.
Yeah.
I mean, nothing could be more counter to this claim that God is infinite.
So I once did like it was like an hour and a half talk on the weakness of God. And I was using John Caputo's book that's titled the same thing, The Weakness of God, like an hour and a half. And I was like, any questions? And like it was like the first or second question was like, yeah, but we know that God's all powerful and blah, blah, blah. I was like, oh my gosh. It's like, we cannot get out of
The idea.
that
Greek philosophical
that Greek
thought
philosophical
foundation.
which turns counter to what we find in the scriptures.
Right. I think I mentioned this when I said this really comes to a fore with Martin Luther and Lutheran theology, and he develops this idea from the weakness of God called the theology of the cross versus the theology of glory. And you can go look this up. There's lots of great Lutheran resources on it. And the theology of cross, to Rick's point, is focused on the paradoxical scriptural claim that God's power is weakness, that God dies, right?
Yeah.
And he says the theology of glory is very much this Greek superbeing understanding of God, where God is all powerful. And then it's all about glory. It's all about how God is going to rescue the day and do these wonderful things and fix my life. And God is going to give me wealth, health, and prosperity, right? And Luther's like, this is not the witness of the scriptures. One thing I want to say with this, you see a split in the Reformation with Luther on one side and Calvin on the other. And a lot of this movement in modern theology traces back to Luther. And if you're like, okay, who cares? Give me some practical import here. Well, one very practical import I think I would say is if you're influenced by the theology of someone like John Calvin. John Calvin believes, he writes in his book just called Christian Institutes, that God has secret decrees, that it is the nature of God to have, he calls them hidden decrees. And one of those hidden decrees is the decree of predestination. So very famously, John Calvin has this theological understanding called double predestination. And this means that God, before the foundation of the world, chose some people to be saved and then chose other people to go to hell, that he predestined to them, irrespective of, some understanding of free will or free choice or needing to accept the gospel or et cetera, et cetera. This is also called election in Christian theology. And Luther comes along and is like, no. And then really past Luther in the 20th century is a theologian we referenced last episode named Karl Barth, Barth. And what he says, using this category of God as event, is that there are not secret hidden things to God's nature, such as some secret decree. He says, when we look at who God is in the person of Jesus Christ, we see a God that is for us and loves us. Therefore, anyone that comes along and is like, well, actually, God is like this, Bart is like, you can't do that. There's not one of the things Bart always says is, there's not a hidden God behind the back of God, as if there is this outwardly facing God and Jesus who's
Never mind the man behind the
right?
curtain.
Yeah, the man behind the curtain, right?
curtain.
Like there's not this God behind God that is like, oh, well, secretly, actually, I've predestined everyone either to heaven or hell.
Yeah.
And it sounds crazy. Like I don't think a lot of Episcopalians are
No.
influenced by John Calvin, so they might be like, oh, whatever. But I mean, I grew up in a religious context where John Calvin was very popular. Lots of people read. The institutes were very influenced by this understanding of God. And so there's real practical import to the way we think and talk about God.
Basic Calvinism says you can't choose God.
Yes.
Because God has already predetermined your choice. I remember I was doing a very basic, I think I was teaching Alpha in a group, like a very basic, like ABC Christianity. And I just mentioned free will. And there was a person in the crowd that was like, and they were absolutely following exactly what you were saying.
Yes.
Like, there's nothing you can do. God has already determined whether you're coming to heaven or not.
Right. Which that's a whole nother, we could do a whole episode on where this theology comes from.
but
Well, and I remember last year when we were going through all of the scriptures, there were times we brought up that God asks for relationship with us, but does not demand it. That
Yes.
the
Force
way that
it.
God presents God's self in our scriptures is that God does not force the issue.
Right.
Because that would be a tyrant God.
Right.
Right. God is not an authoritarian.
Right.
Right. I used this before. Like there was a girl I called up to go to the 8th grade dance. It was really bad. Like that was the days when you had to call somebody and their dad answered, right? And
Yeah,
you'd be like,
yeah.
"Hello, Mr. So-and-so, is your daughter there?" And
Voice hadn't dropped yet.
Yeah.
and so she gets on the phone and I asked her to the 8th grade dance and she said no. She said, "I'm going with friends," which basically said, "I'm not a friend and so I'm not going with you." So, I mean, I was like, I was crushed, but I honored that, right? Like of course, like that's it. If I had said, "Oh no, you must go to the dance with me," like I'm taking that choice away and I am going to force you by pain of hell to go to the dance with, that would be terrible.
Right.
That is not what God does. That is not what a God of love does.
Right.
If someone says, I don't want anything to be a part of you, God is going to honor that choice.
So in his talk, I believe it was at the Spot of God as event where Peter Rollins brought up that moment that's spoken of where Elie Wiesel in his book, I believe it's A Night,
Yeah.
talks about a moment during the Holocaust in a concentration camp where there are people up on the gallows and
There's a child.
people
on the
watching.
gallows. Yeah.
A child among others up on the gallows, and a crowd of people forced
To watch
these people die upon the gallows. And, when people are murdered in this way, it doesn't always happen quickly.
Someone cries out, "Where is God?"
And someone else responds, God is upon the gallows with them.
Yep. God's there on the gallows.
Yep. And so this is a view of God that is highly relational. God is not distant. God is with us in our suffering. Again, an idea that is very different than Greek philosophical understandings of God, which actually say that God cannot suffer, which how Christian theologians thought they could merge that.
So
You kinda
God is
shake your
there in
head.
the suffering. God is not there ending the suffering.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. I think what this view recognizes, especially in so many of the horrors in the modern world, like the Holocaust, is they recognize that when we move away from this vision of God as super being, it problematizes this view of God as like, Daddy, come in and come to the rescue. Yeah. Remember last week we talked about atheistic critiques of God from Sigmund Freud and Ludwig Feuerbach.
Yeah.
And both of these critiques really level the critique against this super being vision of God that says God is just a bigger version of ourselves, because that becomes really problematic when God doesn't stop the Holocaust, right?
Yeah.
And so Elie Wiesel and these others are saying, well, you're missing the point. This is not who God is. It certainly doesn't make those problems go away, right? How we wrestle with that, how we deal with that. Often we have this psychological desire for God to be the one that ends these things, that rescues these. When we come to the Christian faith, I think for many Christians, there is still absolutely the claim that in the end, God will make all right. And I think that's an important and a powerful Christian claim. And we'd have to do a lot of work to think about how we situate that with these these four. But, part of what we're doing here is recognizing different religious thinkers. In this case, we're talking predominantly about Jewish, but in our case, Christian thinkers in theology, how they are trying to talk about God responsibly, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to present to our listeners. I don't think any of the three of us are like, you should take this view.
No.
Right.
You
No,
know.
as going through each of the four, I've thought, well, I know I've found myself falling into this sometimes, but I know I've also felt myself thinking about God this way sometimes.
Yeah.
So I think it's more complex than there being. It's not that we have four ways of talking about God and we are
choose
only ever
one.
going to choose one,
Yeah.
right?
I would say super being is the one I would caution against. I think there are times to go to super being, but it's the one that is most problematic. I think it's the one that is most lends itself to idolatry and just turning ourselves into God, or turning God into the person who likes what we like and hates what we hate.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a problem there. But to say, oh, God is absolutely ground of being, is to miss the whole point of ground of being, which is to say you cannot absolutize any understanding of God, that God is always going to be larger than we could ever point to.
So I have a thought with this, and I'm curious to hear you all's reflection. I think one thing to ground this in Scripture that all four of us, I'm mixing up my numbers now, that the three of us agree on is all four of these ways are found throughout the Scriptures. And this goes to our view of Scripture last year, that Scripture has lots of ways of talking about God, of imagining God. And in some sense, our foundation is the person and work of Jesus Christ, right?
Yes.
So here is something...
As Christians,
As Christians, yep.
Especially.
So here was my thought with this and thinking about it with Scripture. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So I would say superbeing is arguably, quantitatively speaking, the largest number of ways of talking about God in the Scriptures. Like if you just made a list of scriptural verses of descriptions of God, superbeing might be far and away have the most number of scriptural citations you could give. With that being said, to your point about caution and the problems of it, as Christians, I think when we're reading the Gospels, this is the view of God that Jesus challenges consistently and the most throughout the Gospels, which presents a really interesting, unique problem about the relationship of Jesus and the Scriptures and ways of talking about God for us as Christians. But I don't know what your reflections are. You seemed a little I'm not so sure about your claim that it would have the most citations.
So I would say absolutely. If you think about just the stories. When we read through the Bible, there's that section, particularly early on, where it's story after story after story. And most of those stories, God is presented as a super being. But I feel like, and I'm going to think about it some more, but I think once you get beyond the stories, that when it speaks about the character of God and what God is and what God does, that it's more than just the projection of ourselves.
Yeah.
I would say hyper being is probably...
No, I agree. I know what you mean. Yeah, when I was thinking of amount of citations, I was thinking about just how many stories there are and how many verses you could give from those stories describing God. But you're right, and we talked about this in the season of Cover to Cover, there is undoubtedly a progression of the way God is viewed through the Hebrew Scriptures, that as you get into the prophets, Amos 5, I do not desire your sacrifices, I despise your festivals, that there's very much a progression into, even within the Scriptures, a problematizing of this view. Which that's my point of when you get to Jesus in the Gospels, it's really highly problematized, this view of God as super being. I mean, there's countless examples you could give.
Specifically, there's that, rain does not fall on the just and the unjust. oh, God is a super being who bad people,
Yep.
God does not send rain on. And then the good people, God does send rain
Yes.
on, right?
Or I love
where the tower falls
Yep.
on just bad
In Luke.
people, not good people. And Jesus is like,
Yeah.
No,
Or the
that's not-
disciples are like, these people are rejecting you. Should we call down fire upon them?
Right. And Jesus is like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Like, what do you? Yes.
Right.
God is beyond those categories.
Right.
Stop thinking about God in that way.
Yes.
Or stop thinking about God only in that way.
Yeah, and where Peter connects this to my point about Jesus problematizing this view is the caution with super being. I think here's what I'm thinking with why there's so many super being understandings of God in the Hebrew Scriptures and into the New Testament is you said something last week, Rick, that I thought was really perceptive. You said, the God of hyperbeing, we don't really feel like we can cozy up to and
No.
cuddle when we've had a bad day.
Yep.
No one is like,
No.
the God that's really beyond my comprehension and understanding.
just snuggle up
just
to him.
giving me the warm fuzzies when I've had a bad day.
Right.
So I think it's very natural as humans, and when we wrote and talked about God, to have this image of God from Genesis 2 that walks in the garden and says to us, where are you? And when we
God our Father.
yeah, God our Father. And when they show
The
up in the
prodigal.
garden, I love the line of they've put clothes on now, right? After they've realized their guilt. And he's like, what are you doing?
Why do you have?
Yeah,
Why do you have you eaten from the tree?
Yes.
Because I don't know.
Yeah, because I really don't know. So it's this God we can relate to, we can talk to. With that being said, what we find through the Hebrew Scriptures is when that comes to dominate, it becomes a God we can use. And Jesus in the Gospels is constantly mitigating against us trying to use God for our own ends. And even more than that, God is breaking into our preconceived notions and rules and regulations and making our eyes and lives open to others, right? And so like this is where the super being, we just have to be so cautious and it has to break down because we can't just keep using God for our own projects.
Yeah.
I'm kind of capitulating ground we've trod, but
Spent this time trying to think back to a lot of our conversations reading through the scriptures. And so a few thoughts. First, we talked a lot as we were talking about the scriptures about the context in which they were actually written down and by who and what else was going on. And so I think you have to keep in mind all of that influence in how
Of course.
things were written,
Yep.
right? They hadn't been written down before. There may even be a certain amount of we're teaching this for the first time to people. Again, thinking about how we teach little kids almost a super being version of God before we can teach them something greater. So I wonder if some of that has influenced the way in many of those stories were written down. There's also that like sometimes those super being versions verge on the edge of hyper being, even in those stories. So it's a little hard to
Yeah.
fully categorize them in there. There are moments in some of our stories where is it God who showed up, or is it like an
angel.
emissary of God, like when with the wrestling,
Yeah, with Jacob.
Jacob wrestling, like what exactly
Yeah.
happened there, right? Like it's a little hard to understand. And we're reading this all this time later. It's been translated so many times into so many different languages in the interim that there's like little bits of nuance that can get lost in there.
I would venture to, and this isn't scientific at all, but when and where the scriptures are written or told, I would say that where people are at their most vulnerable, people are their most fearful, scared, the more they tend towards God as super being, the God who's going to come and rescue, and God who's going to make everything right, and the God who's going to protect us from the bump in the night. And that the further away, the more security people feel, and the more they're able to actually touch into something deeper, the more expansive their understanding of God is able to be. It's almost like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like if you're not at least providing for food and shelter, then you can't do anything higher on. You can't think about like self-actualization. Here, that if you're scared, worried, if you're struggling to survive, you're not going to be like, oh yeah, gravity and grace, and every once in a while, a little speckling of grace is going to make its way through the universe. But you're going to be like, I need God to walk through the garden and tell me everything's going to be okay.
Right.
And I totally co-sign that. And I've been there too.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, the problem is when you get to, man, I'm trying to think, Ezra, and then, man, what is the minor prophet that's against the Edomites? It might be Obadiah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That one that nobody remembers. If you remember from those, and we talk about this a little bit in Chronicles, there's a couple places there at the end of the Old Testament. Chronicles, Ezra for sure, Ezra and Nehemiah and Obadiah, where if you remember what we talk about in those places is, so like Ezra, I think, if I'm not mixing up books, one of those back there, but I think it's Ezra, is like you cannot marry foreigners.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Ezra is like
And anyone listening that
strict
didn't
on
listen to Cross Connections,
season 2, cover to cover.
yeah, cover to cover, can go check those episodes out for maybe reference to what we're discussing. But this is the caution. This is the view where when you have this God that you've cozied up with is making you feel better, well, then what happens in moments where others are making you angry?
So,
Well, and remember what we said. Ezra and Nehemiah are almost never quoted by the Gospels.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that there was reason for that.
so
Right.
I might amend what I say then. Is that the times we see super God is when we're the most scared,
Yes.
or
the most angry.
the most needing control.
Yeah, right.
When I need to control you, I can't control you with the event. I can't control you with the ground of being, but I can tell you God's going to come down and smite you if you don't do what I say,
Yep.
because
Exactly.
God agrees with me, because I've turned God into my image.
Yep.
So
So we won't go into it here, and maybe we'll do a podcast series on this later, but something for people to look up, and we've circled around it consistently through this conversation, is Dr. James Fowler's Stages of Faith Development.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So this is based off earlier psychological work by a German psychologist named Erik Erikson.
Yep.
That's Erikson, Erikson. And Erikson has these stages of human psychological development. And so this guy, Dr. James Fowler, comes along and he takes this and puts it into stages of faith development. And basically, just to speak to what Natalie and Rick, you have said throughout this podcast, is the first stages really do begin with some of these, to your point, teaching children superbeing, having this God where we can have feelings of trust and assurance that the universe is going to work out. You know, we have respect for the divine. And then as it progresses, there's a number of stages, and I won't read through them, but people can go look them up. There's the final stage. And in the final stage, he calls it universalizing faith or enlightenment. And he thinks this is reached in later adulthood. When they reach this, they kind of drop these black and white understandings of God. And that's something we've talked about a lot here with hyper being and super being and ground of being. And God becomes much less something, a word that is used, to your point, Rick, to control others or to grow angry with someone and use it. So it's just interesting to see that played out in psychological work and thinking through human development in our lives and how the shape of our lives impact the way we relate to God.
Where did Fowler teach?
I don't know. Where did he teach? Was it St. Joe's?
The best seminary.
Wow. My goodness.
The best
Emory?
seminary. Candler School of Theology.
Wow.
Yep.
Is he still alive?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe I should find. Maybe I should find out.
Did you have him over for lunch one time?
Yeah,
You know,
right.
like-
Did he stay at your, is there a picture in your office with him?
No, he was teaching in the 70s. So
Okay.
I was born in the 70s. So
Yeah, all right. All right.
But interesting way to think through this.
Well, we hope we haven't blown your minds, Cross Connectors.
can I just do one little fun thing?
Oh,
Isn't it
yeah. Fun things are great.
Do you guys know Pete Holmes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually
Comedian.
just bought my sister for Christmas tickets to a show of his in Charleston where she lives.
So, comedian, he's did a series on HBO. He has a stand-up show. I think it's on Netflix right now. And he's a friend of Peter Rollins's. And he's a very secular comedian, and some of his stuff is very raunchy. I'm not co-signing any of this stuff, but he does talk about God frequently. And he does a bit where he says, you know, as people of faith, when we ask like who created the universe or what created the universe, we say God, that which you can't see, touch, taste, or photograph, and science can't prove. If you ask an atheist what created the universe, they say nothing, right? Nothing created the universe. It just is. He says, but then I say, I think we can agree that if one of the things your nothing does is spontaneously erupt into everything, that's a pretty magical nothing. And so he says, when you ask
and it's something you can't taste, touch,
nothing,
feel.
right?
Yeah.
It's the exact same thing. And so he says, when atheists say nothing happens to you after you die, and we just go into nothing, he says, I mean, you mean we merge back with your creator? He says, that's heaven.
Yep, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Oh, that reminds me of something that was on a wall when I was growing up in somebody's house about everybody, somebody, nobody, and who was supposed to get something done. And it gets down to like, and then nobody did it. But it's as if nobody was at any rate. Oh, yeah. Well,
What's our next topic? What are we doing next?
I'm going to look at Elliot because he programmed this season and I've forgotten what the next thing is because this was
gonna be great.
kind of so mind-blowing for me.
It's going to be
that-
great.
It's going to be really good.
I
We're
do remember
going to
that
amp up
I
the
was-
scholarship here, right? Like we're going to
Yes,
get.
we're going to be very theological again. Somebody's going to need to send me something to read because I don't know what we're talking about.
Well, this was so elemental and easy. This discussion. I feel like we need.
Sure.
I feel like we need to do something like bigger.
Okay,
Yeah.
but the reason we did this, let's go back to why did we talk about talking about God? Why was this an important conversation to have for as much as it may have blown our minds in some places?
So I think one thing I would say is what Cover to Cover season 2 of Cross Connections accomplished, in my opinion, and our foundation for that was to help people get into the scriptures in a way that recognized this is not easy or simple. That doesn't mean it isn't good. That doesn't mean there isn't a lot of ways reading these texts can transform our lives. But watch out for anyone that is like, oh, the Bible says, or, oh, this is so simple, so obvious.
Here's what God is.
Here's what God is. And so I think we kicked off this season and this year with this topic to do something very similar, to say, just this is who God is a much more complex, messy question and discussion than many people realize. And that's a good thing. Like that's the ground that is able to be tilled and sown and to produce amazing things. But Christian history, Christian theology over 2,000 years has been full of all kinds of ideas and ways of talking about God and thinking about God. And that's an exciting prospect. You know, the journey starts here. It doesn't end with this podcast.
Yep.
I think for me, it's great to know that there are different ways to kind of enter into the understanding. God makes God's self known in so many different ways, which was clear throughout the scriptures as we read through, that the ways in which we can think about or experience God are kind of more of those entry points.
Yep. Which I think will tie right into our next 2 episodes,
All right.
which is going to look at metaphors for God.
Oh, I love this
The
discussion.
various metaphors for God. And I know Rick wanted to pay some special attention to paternal metaphors for God as a father, God as a mother, using that kind of language for God. And I think it'll be fun for us to talk about.
Yeah, which is going springs right out of this conversation.
Springs right out of it.
Because anytime you absolutize anything, you're in dangerous territory with God.
Yep. And when you don't do that, to Natalie's point, there are lots of entryways into relating to God.
Yep. All right.
All right.
Till next time.
We'll see you then. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections. If you didn't listen in last season, we went through and discussed the Bible from cover to cover. That's from Genesis to Revelation, and you can find all of those episodes up now wherever you listen to podcasts. Be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. We love getting your questions. Please call us at 484-588-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. You can also email questions to us at crossconnections@stdavidschurch.org. If you like what you hear, please share this episode with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts so other people can find us as well. And if you really love what you hear, we'd be ever so grateful if you would donate to St. David's Church. You can visit our website at stdavidschurch.org/giving and write Cross Connections in the memo line to indicate your support. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania, and is hosted by
Rick Morley,
Elliot Van Hoy,
and Natalie Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalie Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and Mood Mode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org. That's stdavidschurch.org. Thanks. See you next week.